Welcome everybody. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. Arbor acknowledges the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Nations of the continent, and we recognise their custodianship and continuing connection to its land, waters and community. We pay respects to the elders past and present and future, for they hold the memories, traditions, culture and hopes of Indigenous peoples across the nation. And look, as we're all tuning into this webinar from different locations, maybe even all across the country, I don't know about internationally, maybe you could just in the chat, just type in where it is that you're joining from. For example, I am joining from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne. Just so I get a bit of an idea on where we are. So thanks for that. And thanks for coming to our monthly meeting to enjoy our guest speakers. It's something we've had a few good ones of, and you'll find links to our past speakers on the Arbor website. Thanks to our sponsors, NatureLinks and MZECO for making this webinar possible. My name is Patrick Deasy. I'm actually the chair of the Chemicals in the Management of Biodiversity Working Group, which used to be the glyphosate working group. And I'm talking in from Melbourne, which is where the Victorian branch of Arbor has been active for the last 20 months or so, which is chaired by my business partner at NatureLinks, Rob Scott. And we're keen for new members. We're trying to catch up and assist with Arbor initiatives that can assist our Victorian members and members across the country, as this one I think will. This is not at all state specific. So you can find links for membership on the Arbor website. And then if we can just get a sense of who's attending the meeting, a poll's going to come up in a second, and that will enable you to enter where it is you're from. And also just a reminder that the meeting is being recorded, which includes the chat. And there'll be a link to this put up within a week or so on our website, as I said, the other meetings we've had. Housekeeping, if you've got any questions, type them ahead of time into the, well, not ahead of time because we're here now, but you can put questions into the Q&A. We'll have questions, answers collated throughout the meeting, and we will answer them at the end of the meeting, at the end of the two speakers, rather than throughout. And you can upvote questions as you see them come up. The ones of most interest will be answered first. And it's a webinar format, so communication will be via the chat and QA functions. I'm sorry, but you can't talk. That's the webinar format that we're running with Zoom. So a quick run through of the format, and I'll just answer the poll myself. So a quick run through of the format tonight. We've got two guest speakers who have kindly given their time. Richard Francis will be sharing information on vertebrate pest management for strategic biodiversity outcomes. He'll give an introduction into what products are available now for the management of not only vertebrate pests, but invertebrates pests such as slugs and snails. And then after Richard, we'll go straight to Dr. Linton Staples, who's responsible for a large number of highly successful innovations over a 40-year career span of research and practical innovation and development for the environmental and agricultural fields. Dr. Staples will discuss the innovative and the new humane bait for feral pig control, which is called Hoggone. Pigs are obviously a threat to biodiversity and harbour disease across many areas and ecosystems in Australia. And hopefully we'll have some time, about 10 minutes for Q&As. So we will kick off with Richard. Richard's an ecologist and a botanist, and is the owner of ABZECO, which is Applied Botany, Zoology, Ecology and Ecological Consulting. They're a flora and fauna consulting business based in Melbourne. Richard's got a BSc in botany and zoology and has been working in this field for at least 30 years. He undertakes, and his company undertakes, flora and fauna assessments and land restoration works. Richard's also the president of the Vertebrate Pest Managers Association of Australia. So he brings a wealth of experience and works in this field day to day. So Richard, I'll get you to bring us up to speed on some innovations out there. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear, thanks.
Sweet. All right, I'll try and get this PowerPoint to do its thing. All right, good evening, everyone. So thank you for the introduction, Pat. As Pat said, I'm a consultant, but I specialize in pest animal management and land management. And we have a land management team here based out of Melbourne. And we undertake restoration works largely in grasslands for government and non-government organisations. So today I'm going to talk about some of the methods that we use in our day-to-day works and some of the advice that we give some of our clients on pest animal management for biodiversity outcomes. So I've got a few key topics I'm going to mention, and I'm just going to give some brief information about each of the topics. We only have a short time tonight, so I'm just going to touch on these topics and basically give you some food for thought, hopefully get a few questions, and you'll get a bit more depth from the questions, but I'm going to lead into Linton's more detailed discussion on the Hoggone product. Now, I will be doing a few plugs for Linton's products, which I'm sure Linton won't mind. I don't work for ACTA, I don't get any kickbacks, but perhaps after tonight I'll get a few discounts, we'll see. All right, so some of the topics I'm going to discuss are modified ecosystems. I'm going to go over some management tools, a selection of management tools. There's enough time to really talk about all the ins and outs of vertebrate pest management. I'm going to talk about disturbance, which of course is associated with pest animals. The key management areas that I want to discuss are herbivory and predation. So when I say modified ecosystems, I think everyone realizes that all of the remnants we work in are modified ecosystems. You know, their vegetation structure, their habitat is altered by a range of exotic organisms, be they pest plants, pest animals, overabundant native animals, native plants outside their natural range. And of course, these things alter the vegetation structure. The pest animals alter the soil and vegetation. Herbivory in particular changes vegetation cover. In Greater Melbourne, there's a number of species that now struggle to flower, and of course, without flowering, they can't set seed, and their recruitment is affected by the lack of seed in the environment, and then those recruits are themselves also subject to herbivory. Within the soil, corms and tubers from lilies, orchids and the like are consumed by pest animals. Seeds are harvested directly from plants and from the ground before they get a chance to germinate. And then, of course, the germinants, if they are successful, are often grazed, which prevents the vegetation from recovering from events like disturbance. And these impacts are from such a wide range of pest animals, both vertebrates and invertebrates, that, you know, their cumulative impact has a significant effect on the vegetation. In general, in biodiversity management, in land management, we tend to really only target a few species, key species, the ones that have been traditional pests that have been managed through the landscape. And often they're the most obvious ones. Rabbits, foxes, some areas wild dogs are targeted, and then of course camels, goats, deer, to name a few. But there are more pests than that, and I'll talk tonight about a few specific examples just to get you all thinking. When it comes to management tools, management itself, management of pest animals is a reasonably specialised area. And while a lot of us go into this work, I know I started in land management out of, even before I went to university, but during university, you know, I studied botany and I studied zoology because of course, I love plants and animals. But when it comes to managing pest animals, it's really not sexy work. It's killing. And it's not what I got into this industry to do. So it's something you really have to get your head around in order to get good at it, or even to do it at all. It didn't come naturally to me, but I saw it as a necessary action in order to ensure that other organisms could survive. So in particular, I started off with in eastern barred bandicoots, managing foxes and cats. And yeah, it went from there, let's just say. So for some species, there really are very few options for effective management, certainly at scale. And I'll talk more about some of those later, but a very topical one at the moment is deer. And really, if your only method of control is shooting, then it's very hard to do that at scale, particularly in peri-urban areas where shooting from helicopters is not a viable option. So it's a very expensive, labour-intensive process, and one that's going to be very hard to sustain in the long term, but I'll talk more about that. When it comes to issues in land management, we need to really look deeper into what the causes of these issues are. A question that I get asked so often, and in fact, Pat and I had this discussion recently, we're doing all this weed control. You know, we're getting the cover of high threat weeds and environmental weeds down to really low levels, but we're just not seeing the recruitment that we expected. We're not seeing that recovery. It's not bouncing back like we thought. The plants are seeding, but where are the germinants? And in southeastern Victoria, and I know a lot of eastern Australia, we've had a couple of really good years. Some places too good, too wet, but you know, you'd expect there to be a lot of natural recruitment, but often we don't see it. And I'm going to talk specifically about that and try and help people to understand my thinking and why we do some of the things we do. When it comes to innovation, I think in pest management, I think first we could certainly look more to the existing tools that are used in agriculture. A lot of the pests and a lot of the issues that we're seeing are well recognised in agriculture, particularly cropping. So when it comes to things like mice, we have really good tools available to manage mice. We just have to first work out that mice are an issue and how much of an issue they are, and when are they an issue, and so much of an issue that we need to take action. Same goes for things like slugs and in some areas snails. But for those animals that we really don't have tools for, appropriate tools at scale, we need to, through industry bodies like Arbor, and one of the reasons that I'm in the Vertebrate Pest Managers Association of Australia is so that I can put pressure on government for some of these new tools. I suspect Linton will mention this, but getting new, particularly chemical products to market, getting them through the process of R&D and then registration is an extremely time-consuming and expensive process. And it's something that for some species, and deer is one that's a particular interest of mine, we're going to need some assistance from government to help with that. And because there's such of an issue across a lot of our natural areas and Crown land in particular, I think we can expect that to be the case. Through my role in the Vertebrate Pest Animal Management Association, I've been able to be on panels like the National Deer Control Strategy, and we're trying to get some pressure on government to assist with new tools. Okay. Disturbance is a really obvious issue in our landscape, and it's that physical obvious disturbance is often the thing we act upon. There's some other disturbances that are less obvious than the wallowing by the mobs of pigs we see in the photo on the screen. All pest animals cause some form of disturbance. Mice, which I'll come back to a lot tonight, they actually do a lot of soil disturbance, a lot of digging, tunneling. Rats, the same. Rats do a hell of a lot of tunneling when they're at numbers. It's just less obvious unless you really tuned into it. So we need to be mindful of that in the landscape. It's not just wallows from pigs and deer and channels being cut by buffalo, these large disturbances that are obvious. And then, of course, there's our management. Our management causes disturbance. We're deliberately causing disturbance by removing species, most often weed species. That disturbance can actually often assist pest animals. Things like red-legged earth mites can be assisted in their movement through the landscape by bare ground. They move quite rapidly through bare ground. Dense vegetation tends to slow them down. They don't feel the need to move as far in dense vegetation, so they tend to be more localized. But ground disturbance is most often associated with mammals, and we associate it with mammals. We're all familiar with the effects of rabbits, pigs, deer, donkeys, buffaloes, and the like. This photo is actually red-legged earth mites, and one of the ways you detect them in the landscape is by turning over leaves. If you're in an agricultural setting, it's often things like capeweed. You turn the leaf over and it gives you an idea of how much density of red-legged earth mites you might have in your area. The reason I have those on the screen is I was doing a restoration project back in the mid-90s where we did an intensive restoration in about a hectare, where we tried to set up a really good example of revegetation by completely taking out the weeds, putting down mulch, and getting all of the species into that area that should be there, including orchids, lilies, and a wide range of herbaceous species. And it was going bloody gangbusters. It was awesome. We thought our shit did not stink. We were pretty stoked with it, but after about 3 or 4 years, we had this just chlorotic leaves on a heap of herbaceous species. The greenhood orchids just got smashed, and it turned out it was red-legged earth mites that had come in. They'd had a good year. They're active through, particularly active through spring, and they actually wiped out in 1 year quite a wide range of herbaceous species, and we really struggled to get them back. It never really recovered. And that was partly because of all the bare ground we'd created. And we were so involved in it and present that we were able to detect that it was earth mites. But by the time we'd worked out what to do, the damage was done and the earth mites were going into their diapause phase, where they have eggs that survive the summer, and they really don't become active again until the following season, following year. So the other issue with a lot of our herbivores is we think of them as herbivores, but many of them are omnivorous, and so the impacts they have are quite wide-ranging. So two good examples of these are mice and pigs. Herbivory is most obvious in large mammals. So deer, with their selective browsing in Greater Melbourne and many areas, they're reducing vegetation cover to the extent that they're not only preventing the regeneration, but they're actually altering that structure and composition. We're seeing a lot of the less palatable species moving outside the natural range and dominating areas and completely changing the vegetation structure. So in the foothills around Melbourne, in the northeast in particular, a lot of the grassy dry forest is turning into a shrubby forest, dominated by Kunzia leptospermoides, common name Bergen, and Cassinia longifolia. And with that change, the deer themselves are getting better cover. This dense shrub cover actually suits the deer better, and so the deer are able to occupy more landscape. So their impacts are promoting their spread. Rabbits, we all know about the issue of rabbits, goats. Slugs, I think their issues are not discussed enough. And slugs can be omnivorous themselves. We have had sites with quite high biomass of slugs to the extent where we think it's affected the development of the soil crust, and so they're actually grazing the algae and fungi on the surface, and of course having a major impact on germinants. And mice, what are they doing? Indeed, mice really concern me, particularly in grassy habitats. Through our work monitoring striped legless lizards, it became really obvious that mice were in very high numbers in a lot of our grasslands. And Dr. Megan O'Shea, based at VUT in Melbourne, was very concerned about the fact that mice could well be having a major predation effect on striped legless lizard juveniles. And it was Megan's concern that enabled us to get some funding to control mice in a particular grassland where she was doing monitoring and doing release as part of a study on the effectiveness of release of striped legless lizard. It's a 15 hectare site of grassland that's kind of half dominated by Themida and half by Stipe. The mice we were getting evidence of mice under every roof tile as the project went on. And one really troubling thing that you note when you see the little grass nests that mice form under these roof tiles is the amount of onion grass corms. I've got a photo of that I'll bring up later for those of you who aren't familiar with Romulea. And red-legged earth mites in our grassland, they have these particularly good years, and you get this chlorosis in the susceptible herbaceous species, and it can have a massive effect in restoration sites. And unless you detect it early and see the mites, you might not necessarily be aware of what it is. There are other invertebrates that can have an effect on herbaceous species in our natural ecosystems. And one of them is called bollworm. It's a moth. Helicoverpa punctigera is its name. 3 years ago, we had a particularly big outbreak of bollworm, and it's a natural moth that is largely associated with inland arid areas, but they can fly up in front of storm fronts and get carried large distances by the storms, and they get deposited with the heavy rainfall events. And we manage a couple of grasslands for a species of Senecio macrocarpus. And there was reports coming from further west of the flowering heads getting decimated by some kind of caterpillar, which I recognised was bollworm, was this Helicoverpa punctigera. And we actually did end up taking some action and using a systemic insecticide to control in very specific areas in the plots where we were re-establishing them. We were only able to do that because we got reports from other areas where they're having a major effect. All right, so rodents, a particular passion of mine. So the photo in the bottom of the screen is a bulb of Romulea onion grass. That can have amazing biomass with hundreds of plants per square metre here in Victoria in the volcanic plains. So obviously it is a major competitor for space, light, nutrients and water in our grassy ecosystems. But it was seeing those corms that were being just harvested by mice that made me think about, well, what other palatable bulbs and corms do we have out there? And when you think about things like Microceras, bulb beans, and all those lilies, any tuber forming or corm forming plant, they're going to be susceptible to rodents, particularly mice, and probably rats as well. So in agriculture, there's an amazing product, thank you, Linton, called Mouse Off. It's the active ingredient is zinc phosphide, which is pretty awesome. Mice and rats, they're amazing in the way they can consume. They're so good at finding seed that when you put out Mouse Off, you only actually use 1 kilo per hectare, and it's 1 kilo of wheat. I can actually show you that. And that wheat actually it's dyed black. There's a handful of it there. And it works out that you only get a few grains. It might be 3 or 4 grains per square metre. And a mouse needs maybe 2 grains to kill it. And almost 100% of the grain is taken in the first night because they're so effective at finding the wheat. And so the next day there's no wheat left, and up to 99% of the mice are actually already dead. And whatever you do, we've done transects to try and find mice after we've done a treatment. And we've had, you know, lines of ecologists walking through the grassland trying to find dead mice, and we have not been able to locate one. It's quite remarkable. And the reason for that is because zinc phosphide, when it hits the acid in the stomach of a mouse, it turns into phosphine gas. Now, for those of you that are familiar with rabbit fumigation, it's phosphine gas is what's produced by the tablets, but those tablets are reactive with water, whereas zinc phosphide is completely stable with water and only turns into phosphine gas when it hits the acid of their stomach. So what happens is the mice, before they start to feel ill, they've already consumed 2 grains. They start to feel shit, and the first thing they do is go back to their burrow or wherever they hide, and they rapidly expire. And it doesn't take long for the mice to actually become non-toxic because it's a gas that's given off. So because we were very concerned about potential for off-target impacts, we did go out and we did try and find the mice. But in looking through the literature and in my discussions with Linton's team, there's many thousands of tons of zinc phosphide bait used in agriculture, and there have not been reports of off-target impacts. And it's why this is the only bait that's actually allowed to be used in broadacre agriculture. None of the other baits, anticoagulant baits, are actually licensed for use in anything other than inside buildings or in plastic bait stations. You cannot spread any other bait. This mouse off is a real game changer. It's just amazing. So the grassland that we use it in, we haven't had to apply it for 4 years. We still don't have mice issues in that particular grassland, and that's partly because the surrounding area is largely industrial, so there's not a lot of places for mice to reinvade from. It's just been a remarkable outcome. What we haven't been able to establish yet is if that's had a major change in the germination success and the recruitment of some species. It's going to take some time, and we haven't done control of slugs in that area, so I'd really like to do that and get a good study done. So as I mentioned, mice are actually omnivores. They eat seeds, plant parts, fruits, invertebrates, and potentially juvenile animals, particularly things like young skinks. Now, all right. Slugs, I have a real problem with slugs. Also under the roof tiles that we use in these grasslands, we get at times in some years huge numbers of slugs. I've found that fire has been reasonably effective in management of slugs though, and so it's really only in those areas where we are managing particular species and we don't necessarily use fire often enough. So slug off is again another actor product. I'll give you a look at some slug off. They're really tiny. So what I've been told is that the bait is designed to actually fit in their mouth. Oh, I can't see it. Hang on. they're these tiny lentils. So they fit in the mouth of a slug or a snail, and they've got a radula, which is like a file, has these kind of silicate raspy teeth on it, and they drag this radula across their food. Apparently this lentil fits right in their mouth, and they just graze away at it. It's amazingly effective. Where I've used slug off is in areas where we're managing rare orchids. So sunshine diuris in a little rail reserve. We've used it there many years ago because we detected slugs were actually eating the shoots as they were forming. So that was really effective in preventing further grazing of those orchids. We also did mouse control in that particular situation. I do worry about the effects that slugs may have on the soil crust development, particularly algae. We know that at certain times of year they do go for the algae on the surface, particularly when vegetation is less palatable and there's a reasonable cover of algae. So there's no doubt slugs alter vegetation structure and composition.
5 minutes, Richard.
No worries. And I think their effects are often overlooked. Before I go on, so what I should say is, how do we actually get slug off out at scale, and how do we get mouse off out at scale? What we use is something called a spreader. So a spreader is often used in agriculture for spreading fertilizer or lime, and it's a conical shaped plastic hopper that you can tow behind a vehicle, and we tow one behind our Polaris, and has a disc that spins, and you can change the aperture on the bottom of the conical hopper so that it changes the flow rate of whatever product you've got in it. A disc spins that has fins coming out, and it throws the pellets out. So what we do is we calibrate it by driving along a section and calculating what weight of bait has gone out. Generally, we set it up so that we're only getting about a half rate out, and we do 2 passes across a site. So we do passes east, a set of passes east-west, and a set of passes north-south to try and get an even cover across the areas that we're treating. Initially, I thought we might be able to actually mix slug off and mouse off together, but because they're such different products and they flow differently and different weights, we found you've got to do them separately. But that's all right. It's pretty damn quick. You can use a spreader at like 10 kilometers an hour, so you can cover areas pretty quickly. With predation, cats are a real major issue across most of Australia, and foxes similarly. Cats are particularly hard to manage. Foxes have got particular habits where they bury their food on occasion, and they're quite happy to dig up food. So it's quite easy to use something like this. This is a cooked liver bait here in the bottom of the screen. That's 1080 being injected. You can see it's dyed green. Cooked liver baits come in a plastic tub, and they look like this. just a nice square of liver with 1080 injected into the center. There's also a range of dried meat baits. But the problem with cats is they're not so keen on digging up baits. And so if we were to be baiting cats, we'd have to have food available at the surface. And that's just not acceptable in so many natural areas that we manage because of the off-target impacts. And so cats is one area that there's been a major amount of innovation push. And it's one area where governments have assisted. Foxes, we have a whole range of tools available for foxes. I'm particularly fond of cooked liver baits because they're a natural meat product. I think that I find that foxes tend to take it up much better than other shelf-stable baits that are easier to store and handle. Not a huge fan of the dried meat baits. They tend to be more used in broad areas, particularly agriculture and places like Western Australia where they'll put them on the surface. I'm not a big fan, and I don't think they're as palatable to foxes. I won't go into detail about pigs because I'll definitely leave that for Linton. Dogs or wild dogs, we have a similar range of products available, and it's a really tricky question. I'm not going to go into that debate of when is a wild dog a dingo and where a dingo is appropriate. I tend to stay out of dog management myself. Cane toads, there's been a lot of development, particularly attracting with sonics. But the example that I want to give of innovation is cats. I have thrown brush-tailed possums up there just to get people thinking. When we create areas that are predator-free, so enclosures for bandicoots, numbats, a range of small mammals, there can be other consequences. And one of those that quite commonly crops up, particularly in this part of the world, is brush-tailed possums, and they definitely are omnivores. And we have sites where we do rabbit counts within predator-free enclosures, and we have got to the point where we're counting more brush-tailed possums than rabbits. And they're in groups of up to 10. They're killing the hollow-bearing trees, and we suspect they're also preying upon young mammals, possibly southern brown bandicoots or eastern barred bandicoots. So eastern barred bandicoot enclosure in particular at Jellybrand Hill has huge numbers of brush-tailed possums, and there is a lot of concern about the effects that they may have. And rats I've already discussed. So the example of innovation and predator control that I want to give is the Felix or the grooming trap. This is a pretty awesome trap. So it actually shoots gel with 1080, and it's a smart trap. It's been designed with these sensors. So any animal that's too tall, it won't shoot the gel at. And these sensors here are about detecting when a quadruped walks past and looking under its underneath its belly, so that if you imagine a cat, these sensors, once all the sensors have detected that it's the right size, the right shape, and it's standing side on, it shoots this gel at the fur, which makes use of a cat's natural reaction, which is to clean itself by licking. So they lick the 1080 gel off themselves and effectively poison themselves. Because cats are so difficult to control, this is a major bonus. for our industry. Cat trapping is hugely labour intensive because you can set traps across the landscape, but they have to be checked constantly, which drains resources, particularly financial resources or land managers' time. Shooting at cats is ineffective at scale, and of course it's hugely labour intensive. As I mentioned, targeted baiting of cats is really quite challenging because of the fact that they just don't dig baits up, and so we're putting other animals at risk when we do control. Deer are another area where we need innovation. Currently, shooting is the only tool that we have available in Australia at any scale, and it's really only aerial shooting that's proved to be particularly effective. In much of Australia, particularly down the east coast, it's got to the point where if we really want an area of vegetation to be deer free, it just has to be fenced. There's been a lot of innovation in fencing, but fencing's extremely expensive to do, as I'm sure everyone's aware. But there has been a lot of work in setting up fences that are still porous to a lot of our macropods. The larger deer species are less inclined to go under fences regularly, and so having fences that are close to the ground and using things like hinge joint or ring lock has been reasonably successful in managing deer in the landscape, but very expensive. So in the National Deer Control Strategy, one of the strong recommendations is that we develop some new tools, in particular chemical control, so that we can get control of deer at the kind of scale that it's needed. Even if much of the landscape is now got to the point where we can't effectively control deer, the big push is to try and remove those smaller isolated populations of deer, particularly to the west of the Great Dividing Range, and try to put a line in the sand so that we can halt that spread of deer to the west. Target areas like around the Grampians and some of those pockets in Western New South Wales where we have deer, try and get their numbers down to where they're undetectable and try and prevent them spreading and establishing like they have elsewhere. So as you can see, I've got a photo of a deer's mouth here because I realised that most people don't get to see a deer's mouth. You note that on the top of the mouth, there's actually a bony plate. There are no teeth. The teeth are these large incisors on the bottom jaw. And so this is how we can tell whether plants are getting browsed by deer, because they bite the stems and they don't tend to cut neatly. They tend to semi-crush the branch and they pull backwards stripping. And so what you end up with is often this quite pronounced tag on the branches, whereas when you've got wallabies or kangaroos browsing, tends to be quite a neat cut of browse. So it makes it quite possible for you to assess an area and try and work out what percentage of the browsing damage we're seeing is actually by deer. And then you can validate that through thermal spotlighting surveys in the evening. And the other technique we're using is we're putting in a lot of what we call exclosure plots where we exclude deer. So we put 10 by 10 metre fenced areas within conservation areas to exclude the effects of deer. And often we still allow other macropods to access those areas, so we're controlling only for deer. And that helps us to understand what level of impact deer are having, and also to measure whether or not our control is effective. When I say we need innovation in deer control, we actually do already have products that have been developed. This one is a treadle activated bait station. So this was developed for goats, and you can see that with this mesh structure, the default of this trap, this bait station, there's a process whereby you start by free feeding, and there's a number of steps in order to get the goats established as feeding from the bait station. And it's only once you've established that, monitoring with cameras and the like, that you then will put in the bait, the poison bait. But the beauty of this trap is that all of the macropods we have got these large flat feet. And so when they approach the bait station, this treadle is pushed down and the bait station is closed. So they can't access the baits in the bait station. What we're lacking is a bait product that's actually registered for use on deer. And the other consideration when we're thinking about targeting deer rather than goats, a bait station like this, it could be much higher off the ground, and that would further reduce the likelihood of other animals getting access to it. I've seen one design where there's actually a pole and a hopper at the top of a pole where a deer can put its head in, and it prevents animals from being able to climb up the outside of it because it's a smooth steel pole and hopper, and the gate mechanism on the hopper, it's set open, so deer can just walk up and feed from it. It's only when an animal approaches and pushes that treadle that the hopper's closed and no longer accessible. So that's a major innovation that we're pushing for, but that the key here is getting a bait product registered for use on deer. The example I've got here, these green pellets, are pellets that are currently used in New Zealand for the control of brush-tailed possums, and they drop them from helicopters. It's not just possums, it's weasels and stoats as well. And of course, they don't have native mammals that are susceptible to bait. So they scatter these across forests to control possums, largely to try and control tuberculosis that is spread to cattle. But of course, it has the added bonus of improving vegetation structure and reducing predation on small birds and other animals. But what's been found is that when they do spread these 1080 baits, they get a 90% reduction in deer through that landscape. So they're obviously very effective on deer. And I would hope that it's the kind of product that we might see soon available to us in Australia. Happy to get you to comment on that, Linton. All right, I think I've used up more than my fair share of time. I tried to run through it as quickly as possible. I know I've only really touched on a number of topics, but hopefully it's got you thinking.
Thanks for that, Richard. That's great. Really, especially those last few things are very interesting, and yeah, lots of innovations out there. And yeah, as you say, getting people to think a bit more outside the box. So yeah, I certainly hadn't thought of mice and things that much, and but it's obviously, yeah, it makes sense in an agricultural sense. So why shouldn't it make a sense in the natural resource sense? So we'll move on. We are running a little bit behind time, but Linton's got a very interesting talk, so I'm sure you won't mind hanging around to listen to that. And it's Dr. Linton Staple started his research career as a reproductive biologist at Cambridge University. And when he came back to Australia, he observed that foxes were posing a bigger threat to land production and wildlife than that was previously recognised, which led to him developing Foxo, which is the first shelf-stable commercial bait to enable systematic predator control. He's successfully developed products to better control wild dogs, which is Foxacute, and Dogabait, rabbits with Rabate, feral pigs, Pig Out, and now Hoggone, cane toads, Toadinator, actor attractor, invasive ants with ant-off synergy, plague rats, rat-off, and mouse-off. He was also contracted to prepare the full regulatory documentation for the calicivirus. So over a period of 11 years, these projects have been estimated to have yielded on-farm benefits alone exceeding $850 million. Linton's company, Animal Control Technologies, has received BHP, Fujitsu and Telstra awards for environmental excellence and best business practice. So thanks, Linton. If you could illuminate us to your latest innovation.
Well, I hope you can hear me. Just put your hand up.
That's
if
all
you can
good.
hear me all right.
Yep,
Yeah,
that's
good.
all great.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you, Richard. Your next paycheck will be in the mail for promoting all my products. And I have to assure everybody there was no collusion whatsoever, and Richard will confirm that, but it was very nice to see my products being talked about by someone other than me. So I know we're way over time, so I'll just chuff straight into talking about pigs. I won't really divert. So if I can share my screen, hopefully.
That's good. We can see that.
Luckily, there's no porn sites or something on my desktop. That'd be terrible, wouldn't it? Right. So if I show you a slide, hopefully this will come up as a slide. Right. Okay. You should be able to see a slide.
That's good.
I can move straight on from, and I'll. If I can work out how to do it, I'll try to get myself appointed, but I might not be able to. Anyway, I'll go fairly quickly, otherwise this will be the inevitable result of my presentation. That's me in Riga talking to a man about pig control in Europe, and obviously he wasn't impressed. Rich has done such a great job of talking about my products, and so have you, Patrick. I won't need to spend any time on this, but yes, I came out of a fundamental science sort of background, and in fact was criticised on my early career for being an ivory top academic with nothing practical. So I actually swung the other way and said, let's apply some science and actually fix some problems. So that's basically what I've devoted myself to for the last 30-something years. But what I'll talk to you about today is the bottom left-hand side there, Hoggone, which when I prepared this slide a long time ago, Hoggone was in process, but now it's a reality. So I'll talk to you about that. Just by way of acknowledgement, I don't know, can you see the whole slide there, guys? I've got my picture of myself covering up part of the slide, but
no, it's good.
Okay. So there's a very big American component to this project, and also the project arose out of our association as a commercial partner with the Invasive Animals Cooperative Research Centre, which has now morphed into a different structure with which we're not terribly involved. But I just wanted to sort of, by way of dotting T's and crossing I's, acknowledge particularly Steve Lappage in the pink shirt there, who now runs a CRC of his own in Adelaide. But he sort of brought me into this particular project a bit and recognised my capability, I suppose, in turning a theory into a practical reality. But we've got tremendous collaboration from Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, which itself is bigger than the state of Victoria, and the US Department of Agriculture. And in fact, this Hoggone project is the highest priority project, I believe, in the US Department of Agriculture in the pest management field. So why the hell is it such a big issue for Australia and America? And I hope I can explain that pretty quickly. But they are a major invasive pest species. They do environmental degradation. They predate on stock. They have very big wildlife implications. Most importantly, and very current at the moment, as you'll see in a moment, huge disease risk and massive crop damage when they crank up. We want to remove them from Australia, but frankly, it's impossible. So our management strategy is to try to locally reduce the populations and the damage that they cause. But in the USA, as you'll see in a moment, and I think there's lessons from the Americans for us here, the USA tries to eradicate where they have small-scale incursions in different states, and these incursions are largely by hunters moving the pigs in to provide a hunting resource for future years, and it's an absolute disaster. But where they've got endemic pigs, like in Florida and Louisiana, South Carolina and Texas and California, they try to just manage the same way as we do. Hopefully at the bottom of the slide there, you can see damage to, from left to right, damage to a riparian habitat, close association. That I think that I've got the stuff over the top of my pictures. I can't see them properly, but pigs feeding from a corn feeder is a classic old photograph of a pig eating a dead lamb. And pigs have driven sheep farmers out of lamb production in large parts of Queensland and New South Wales. The photo of the pigs and the cattle together is to remind us that pigs are cloven-hoofed animals. Our biggest disease threat in Australia is foot and mouth disease, and you can see the potential for that to be transferred between pigs and cattle and everything else. And the photo bottom right, hopefully, if you can see it, is just a trail of pigs coming in and out of a sorghum crop. So the disease risk is a big ticket item, and I put this slide up very deliberately because I used to list here some of the actual and current disease threats of feral pigs. The current ones on the slide until recently were leptospirosis and brucellosis. Brucellosis, both of those are reportable diseases. They can be lethal in humans, and they are present, particularly brucellosis in pigs in Queensland, less so in New South Wales and other states. But I had potential ones called foot and mouth disease, African swine fever or ASF, and Japanese encephalitis virus, the bottom top left virus. And I don't know if you've been reading your newspapers lately, but Japanese encephalitis wacko came into Australia big time about 3 or 4 weeks ago, was discovered by virtue of people presenting in hospital with unexplained viral encephalitis. Quickly, the doctors worked out it was Japanese encephalitis. Quickly, they said this must be coming from pigs somewhere, and it was. It's transferred from pigs to humans by mosquitoes, and it's already present as of 2 weeks ago in 58 different commercial piggeries in Australia in 4 states. And I saw a news release that it's in feral pigs in the Northern Territory. You can pretty well say this major exotic new disease is now endemic, and it became endemic before we even knew we had it. That sends warning bells, and should send warning bells through everybody, because our AusVet plan required and was framed around the idea that a disease, whichever one you specify, would get in at a specific site, and we could put a barrier around it, put a buffer zone and stop transport and prevent it. But this disease, as an example, it's probably not the worst one in the list, but it's a pretty serious one, about the same death rate as COVID-19, is a serious threat, and it has got in without us even knowing about it. That's got to be sending warning signals everywhere. But they also carry bacterial, viral, protozoan diseases of humans. And to be speculative for your group, because I know you're wide-thinking people out there, I put Ebola and Zika, and it's not a light statement because the Reston strain of Ebola virus can be experimented with in pigs, or it can be experimented with in general because it affects monkeys or primates, but not humans or non-human primates. So anything else, if you try to experiment with it, tends to kill you in the Ebola field. But they have shown that pigs can be infected with the Reston strain of Ebola. They get a sort of influenza and cough and sneeze, and monkeys stored near them die from Ebola. And the other one that's concerning me, but there is no proven link here yet, I've got to stress, is Zika virus, which causes a problem called microencephaly in humans, i.e. babies born with very small heads and brains. Very difficult problem. It has been experimentally given to pigs, and they have litters of piglets with small brains, exactly the same symptomology. And we already know that Japanese encephalitis is transferred via mosquitoes from pigs to humans. Zika virus is transferred between humans by mosquitoes. Pigs can contract Zika virus. Pregnant women exist where there are pigs and mosquitoes. And you don't need to be a rocket scientist to work out that we could have a problem in the future. So that's a problem in the north of South America and states like Florida in the USA. So this is actually a serious problem. The photo, by the way, I just took off the internet. That's a lot of pigs and some sheep. The sheep are the white things, the pigs are the black and brown things. And this farmer was apparently trying to feed grain to his sheep to feed them, but the pigs worked out that grain was pretty handy. So you can see in a worst case scenario just how bad this problem can become. In China, pigs are a very big business. China has 50% of the world's farmed pigs. That picture is not a big hotel in China. That's a piggery, 10 or whatever stories high, 8 stories high. And in China, they actually farm about 50% of the total farmed pigs in the world. And that's an enormous pig industry, dwarfs anything else combined. But they've already had to slaughter something like, I think, about 250 million pigs, nearly 50% of the population, and due to the incursion of African swine fever. That virus is not here yet, but of course, we've shut down international travel, and breakthroughs through our quarantine system have been slower because of that. I suspect as we open up our international travel, we will have incursions of African swine fever, and I know the pig industry is very concerned about that. So when you look at, as Richard was saying, some of these pervasive impacts of pest animals, well, this is a pest virus, but pig meat made up 25% or so of the Chinese protein supply in their diet. So when you take out 50% of 25%, you've had a 12% loss of protein in the entire nation. These are big ticket items. And to get rid of them, the pigs can't be cured, so all you can do is slaughter them. And in fact, these are some graphic scenes of pigs taken live and buried in pits to get rid of them. And it's a really big issue. It's horrendous. I'm very pleased to say with Hoggone, we've just shown that we can humanely kill pigs in piggeries very quickly. And before they die, you can walk them to a collection point unstressed, and they die without any adverse symptoms. So we've just had, with the cooperation of Australian Pork Limited and Australia, one of Australia's largest piggeries, a very big breakthrough. So I won't mention that any further. African swine fever is a major disease still throughout the world. If it wasn't for COVID-19, it would be front page news everywhere. But that latest graph showing Europe is the incidence of positive cases of African swine fever as it moves through from originally Russia, and it went downwards into China, and now it's moving westwards into Central Europe. Ukraine, you'll see, has only got 2 dots in it. I think there's a problem with reporting from that part of the world at the moment. But Germany is very worried about losing their pig industry, and so also is Denmark. The pig industry in Denmark is 17% of their economy. So there's not small ticket items for pig diseases. Now, pigs are a pretty good animal. They're a bit like rabbits. If conditions are good, they can breed very rapidly. This is probably the upper end of a pig litter. I think it's 9 piglets in there, but a litter size of 5 or 6 is pretty common, pretty regular, pretty normal. Once the protein level gets up enough in their feed, away they go, and they can respond to our control. So it's not a matter of controlling them and saying, job's done, they've all gone away. If you leave any behind, they're back in a flash. And that's what's wrong with our pig control over the last 30 or 40 years. As I said, they're major invasive species with a lot of environmental damage, but they also cause wildlife damage. And the photo bottom left and centre is courtesy of Jim Mitchell, who's an old school kind of very good, knowledgeable pig expert in far north Queensland. That's a pig stomach full of turtles, and the one on the right is, I think, full of frogs. Again, the picture of the pig predating lambs, major problem, and the disease risk for cattle. But they're a bloody nuisance as well. That photo top left and again top right, different properties. That sort of damage to a paddock, and these are dairy farms, I think, can occur in one night from a mob of pigs. They are unbelievably destructive to good quality pastures and paddocks. The house picture is a house in America, in California, I think, and they don't tend to have fences around their houses there. And these people went to bed with a lovely front garden and got up in the morning, and the pigs had come in and completely destroyed the place. So this is why we collaborate with the Americans. The map on the left is an old and somewhat speculative sort of survey report of the density of pigs. The basic point is, probably not very accurate anymore, but the basic point is they're a massive problem throughout Queensland. They're spreading southwards through New South Wales. They are present in Victoria and increasing rapidly and uncontrolled at the moment, and they're also in southwest Western Australia and the Northern Territory. The only places they don't do well are extreme arid zones, and if you look at that blue area in sort of northwest South Australia and the desert country in Western Australia, and then cast your eye to the right-hand picture, which is at about the same scale, a map of pig spread in the USA with time, you'll see they're not doing very well in Nevada and all the bad country there with bows and arrows and cowboys and things. very arid zones. They need water to wallow in hot conditions, and if it's not there, they don't do very well. But they're able to colonise very large parts of the rest of America, and they will go up through the centre into Canada, and Canada already has a pig problem in its wheat sheep zone. So this is not a static problem. This is an emerging problem, and in both countries, it's rapidly expanding. Why? Nobody knows. These pigs in America have been there since Christopher Columbus, and ours have probably been there not long after or at the same time as Captain Cook. And they haven't been a problem for a long time, but in the last 40 years, they've just taken off big time. So we are not in a static situation. We have a rapidly deteriorating situation, and we're not managing it very well. That's my political statement for the night. Now, America can tackle their pig problem. If you look at the map on the left, you see all the little grey lines, hopefully there inside each state. They're the county boundaries. So in, for example, Texas down the bottom, where there's a big green patch and a yellow patch of pig infestations. In fact, pigs are in all but one county in Texas, last I heard. They've got, I think, in Texas alone, 250 counties. Each county has a pest management authority and a team. They've got a Department of Agriculture at a state level, and then they've got a federal Department of Agriculture, which has at least, I think, a 20 or 30 million US dollar budget annually for as long as it takes to stimulate action on pigs. That's not to control the pigs, that's just seed money. So they've got 320 million people in America spread across the landscape, and certainly large numbers of people where the pigs are. They've got 3,143 counties, and that's 12 times as many counties as we've got in Australia. They've got 35 people per square kilometre on average across the nation to tackle their pigs and every other pest. We've got, counting Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, 0.3 of a person per square kilometre. And that's fundamentally where we're stuffed, is we just don't have any hands on the ground. And unless we've got land managers on the ground or a flood of capable contractors like Richard, that's a BUOMI, we just can't even think about controlling the pigs. So here's why we're working with the Americans, because they've got a better chance than we have, and they recognise that, and they structure their affairs accordingly. So what do? We do what's called corral trapping. That's the modern way to trap pigs. We used to use box traps, and I've even seen seminars recently where people are inventing new types of box traps, which most of us abandoned about 25 years ago, but they're still being reinvented. But corral traps are much more complicated, big-scale traps that try to trap a whole group of pigs completely, and that's the secret to success. So if you're going to trap, at least have a decent trap, and the Americans have perfected this to a great extent compared to us. They also use drop nets. The bottom left picture, I think, is a group of pigs feeding at a feeding point, and there's a net above them, and at a desired point you can trigger the dropping of the net. The problem with that is that pigs get tangled up in the net, and it's very inhumane to control them, and they wreck your net, and it's not a very good technique. I don't think we'll use it. The Americans use fixed wing, aerial and helicopter shooting on a grand scale, which I'll come to in a moment. We daylight shoot from the ground. It's a bit of a sporting thing, as it is in Europe, but we also increasingly are using night vision shooting because the technology is getting better and better. And we try to fence to get exclusion zones, but our primary control tool is baiting, which is what I want to talk to you about. But before I get to baiting, a bit of an anecdote. I showed before the pigs with African swine fever are now on the eastern side of Germany and moving from right to left across the map of Europe. And so Denmark, 17% of its export income comes from its pig industry, so they're very concerned. So they decided to build a fence between Denmark and Germany, which is what I've shown with the blue arrow there. It's a 70-kilometre wide isthmus, and they're very proud of themselves. They spent 70 million euros, it's €1 million per kilometre of fence, think about it. And they made it out of wire mesh 1.5 metres high and half a metre into the ground, so pigs couldn't tunnel under. If any of you have trapped pigs in Australia, you don't make your traps 1.5 metres high, you make them at least 1.8 metres, because if you only make them 1.5, the pigs jump out. So their 70-kilometre, 70 million euro fence is about, I don't know, 20 or 30 centimetres too short to be effective. But I was at a meeting where they were very proudly announcing the success of this fence project. And I said, you realise it'll stop the pigs moving from one land to another, but it won't stop the virus, African swine fever, and they all looked at me like I was stupid. And I said, if you've got an estrus sow on one side and an infected boar on the other, they're going to rub noses at the barrier. And you should have heard the room go quiet until someone said, holy shit, we're going to have to build another fence on the other side to put a barrier and then a minefield in between. Pigs destroy fences. They're putting badger gates in their fence to let the badgers run between Germany and Denmark. So it's not going to work. The picture on the right is a fence built by a guy called John Scriven, who's a very capable land manager in Queensland. He built that for about €5,500 per kilometre, and it's actually a better fence than the one they've got in Denmark. And he's trying to keep feral pigs and roos from overgrazing a property that he looks after. Coming back to the helicopter shooting, these are a slide kindly loaned to me by Mike Bodenchuk, who is the biggest shooter of pigs in the USA by a factor of 10 to the next most important player. And he runs big USDA programs. A large part of his budget is on ammunition. That'll give you an idea of the kind of guy Mike is. He's a very keen shooter. But at the end of the day, and these are a little bit old, these figures, at best, with a high pig density locally, it's costing about $20 a pig by helicopter and over $50 now with fixed-winged aircraft. And his map of Texas there shows where he has been running programs, but you can't shoot pigs in the middle there because that's Dallas or something like that, or San Antonio. And so it's limited in, people don't like you flying over with a helicopter gunship shooting pigs if you're in the suburbs of San Antonio. And likewise, on the right-hand side, there's a lot of scrub and you can't see the pigs. So yes, a lot of pigs have been killed, but in fact, there's probably 2.5 million pigs in Texas, or 3 million pigs. 1.5 million of them are females, raising 5 piglets each per year, pretty typically. So whatever that is, 7.5 million pigs production per year, and they've killed 50,000 with the biggest shooting program ever. And so they've lost the battle. End of story. The large corral traps, as I say, in America are well researched, and there's probably now 6 or 7 major companies providing these. They are very expensive, like above $5,000 per trap. They're difficult to move around, so there's a very high labour cost with them, but they are effective because they do tend, if properly run, to collect a large group of pigs from a family group all at once. And that is the key to good pig control. So yes, they work. Yes, they play a role, but for Australia, they would be a prohibitive option. But I'm not saying we shouldn't use them. We need everything we've got. And they've got very fancy ones in America running off the Horizon phone network that can monitor pigs being present, and you can remotely trigger the trap to shut. So we use poisons here. The one Richard's mentioned is sodium fluoroacetate. We put that on grain and in carcass meat, and we just put that on the ground and hope that the pig eats it and nothing else. That's never the case. And we put it in Pig Out, which is a product I developed with the 1080 localized in the core, and more recently an economy version of that called Pig Out Econobate. We have experimented with warfarin, which is a first generation anticoagulant. Pigs happen to be sensitive to this particular chemical, but they may bleed to death over a period of anything up to 20 days. It was tested, it killed pigs, but it was totally inhumane and abandoned. The Americans tried to introduce it, a separate company to ourselves, tried to introduce it a while back, and it got banned before it even got used by the state agencies in America. It's quite an interesting story how that happened. But we in Queensland still use yellow phosphorus mixed with carbon disulfide, which is called CSSP. I don't believe it's humane. I don't endorse it, and I don't think we should use it. I just think if we're going to have to kill a pest animal, we need to do it as cleanly as we can. So that leads me to Hoggone. And sorry, that's the various versions of Pig Out and Pig Out Econobate, just to show you what those things look like. Does 1080 work on pigs? There's some Pig Out baits and a group of pigs eating them. And hopefully if it shows up, that's the same group of pigs the next morning. They're all the same patterns on their side. And 1080 does kill pigs, but you need a large amount of it because pigs are not sensitive, as sensitive at least, as dogs, foxes and cats, and rabbits, which are the 4 most susceptible species. So yes, 1080 baiting works. We do get some pigs, but it's probably not ideal. So why did we investigate sodium nitrite? Well, it's a very simple chemical. nitrite, not nitrate, be careful there. It's very quickly absorbed by oral administration, so if you eat it, you get it. It causes almost immediate action on your red cells to oxidize the heme group, which is your hemoglobin protein, which is your carrying protein for moving oxygen around the system. And the normal hemoglobin binding site for oxygen, the iron in that is in the what they call Fe2+ or ferrous state, but nitrite acts on that to turn it to methemoglobin, where the iron is actually oxidized by the nitrite to Fe3+, and methemoglobin, which is hemoglobin but just with a slightly different characterization of the iron, just doesn't carry oxygen. So at about 70 or 80%, we've never measured much higher than that with a dead animal, the animal dies, and it dies quietly. The process is called metabolic anoxemia, which is a veterinary term, and that means you lack metabolic oxygen. It is not the same as asphyxiation, where you struggle because your carbon dioxide levels build up and you struggle to get a breath. In fact, metabolic anoxemia occurs also with carbon monoxide poisoning, and it's called insidious hypoxemia. In other words, you don't know it's happening, and your first symptom is you fall asleep and become unconscious, and then you die. So it is actually very humane, almost close to a gold standard for humaneness, and that's what's prompted a lot of interest in this project. Added to that, pigs turn out to be the most vulnerable animal because of all the animals. Most of us have got a protective mechanism, which is an enzyme called methemoglobin reductase, which helps us to convert our methemoglobin, if we get any from food sources or other things, back to normal hemoglobin. So every animal has a level of this. Pigs lack it more than everything else. They've got it, but they don't have very much of it. So they're particularly susceptible because once they get a lot of methemoglobin, they can't convert it back to get out of trouble. The action is quick, 1 to 2 hours if you give a large dose of the chemical, and there are no, well, not no residues, there are low residues. In fact, the residues we've measured very accurately, and they're about the same as you get in bacon or preserved meats or sausages, where it's used as a food preservative at low levels. So technically you could eat the dead pig and you wouldn't be at risk, and so could any other animal, but we don't recommend that because it's just not good practice. There's therefore no secondary poisoning risk. Big difference from 1080. But like all good innovations in science, great features, but there's also some lurgies. Sodium nitrite, or even worse, potassium nitrite, its little brother, is saltpeter. It's the saltiest compound known, and pigs are salt aversive. So you're trying to feed a very salty chemical to a pig that doesn't like salt. Not easy. We've got to give a large amount of it. So it's not a matter of hiding it and letting it creep up. We've got to give a bucket load of it, which is of the order of 10 to 20 grams, so that all the hemoglobin gets converted quickly to methemoglobin. The chemical itself is totally unstable and powerfully hygroscopic, i.e. it absorbs and sucks moisture, H2O, out of the air to degrade. It breaks down, when it does break down, to noxious derivatives, and pigs don't like noxious derivatives because they've got good noses. So it affects bait palatability, and it ultimately will react with the bait itself and destroy it. It's very powerful chemistry here. It is an aquatic toxin, but we're really not putting it in waterways, and that's the least of our concerns. I can't see the bottom of my slide here, but I think it says something along the lines that, you know, it kills effectively and environmentally friendly, but we've got to make it palatable to work. Now, I was told this group were interested in the chemistry of herbicides and things, so I put this slide in, and apologies if I've been misadvised here, that you're really not a bunch of chemists, you're a bunch of environmentalists, and this is sort of basic inorganic chemistry. But I just wanted to show you these reaction paths. NaNO2 is sodium nitrite. If it meets the acid in a pig's stomach, it converts to nitrous acid, HNO2, plus the salt of the sodium chloride. That's of no harm. But nitrous acid, HNO2, in the second line breaks down by itself to nitrogen dioxide and nitrous oxide, NO, and water. NO is one of the noxious nitrogen sort of gases. It's painful to smell, and it's biologically very, very potent chemical. So it not only hurts to receive it, but it also does weird things to your biochemistry. Then that, or the nitrogen dioxide, can react with the water that it just created in the middle equation to form nitric acid and nitrous acid. And on top of all that, slowly the nitrite, NaNO2, can oxidize to NaNO3. It can also react with other bait components. I won't go into that. But the critical thing of this stuff called NO in the second line, nitric oxide is the name of that gas. It's actually a very potent, at microgram levels, vasodilatory substance. And what I think is happening when the pig gets a bucket load of this in its stomach and absorbs completely is all of its blood vessels dilate and you get a massive drop in blood pressure. So I think the pigs faint even after a mouthful of the bait. Then they go away and sit down to get over the fainting, but then the chemistry takes over to convert their hemoglobin to methemoglobin, and they basically never get up. So they just sit down, go to sleep and die. It is that good. So, but if it doesn't stay stable in the bait, you don't get good uptake. Now, this is one of about 1 million photos I could show you of our early attempts. You'll see those little cylinder baits on the left beside a stick with a T on it. And that's the toxic bait with the nitrite in it. And the F on the stick on the right is what we call free feed or placebo, which is the same bait without the toxin. And I think you'll agree the pigs are eating the one without the toxin and not taking a lot of interest in the one with the toxin. That's what you call immediate aversion. Likewise, in the top right photo, we tried putting it on corn. The pile of corn on the left is placebo corn untreated, and the one on the right's got the nitrite on it. Next morning we came back and they'd eaten all the placebo corn. There's a mob of pigs in this site, and they'd left the other one. And notice how orange it's become. That's the reaction of the nitrite with the corn in one night in just moist air. This is horrendously difficult to hold still. So I took myself off to this very pretty place in Switzerland near Basel, which is called Bubendorf. And Switzerland has a lot of chemical industries embedded in their little villages, which is quite different to what we have. So I went over there when I learnt they had some very special technology, and I was very much welcomed by a top, actually it's a UK company with a research facility in Switzerland, but they're a global company. And they helped me develop, using this machine in Switzerland, which I now own and moved to Australia, a microencapsulated form of the product. So here we are trying to kill pigs, and have a look at the machine we're using to do it. This is a multi-million-dollar facility just to microencapsulate nitrite to hold it still. So, and then we took our microspheres to CSIRO in Clayton, and this is a very helpful girl called Melissa de Vries. And that little gizmo on the left there is what they call a secondary ion emission electron microscope. So it doesn't only take a picture of your product, it actually tells you what the surface is made of. I won't go into the details, but it's a fancy bit of kit. There's only one in Australia. So if you tell the computer in that machine to colour sodium red, and you put granules of sodium nitrite that are uncoated under the machine, you'll see it's red. This is not the greatest photo because there's a lot of background scatter and green colour, which is the stage on which the granules were put. But you'll see in the bottom, you get a peak of sodium showing there, one of those yellow peaks about the middle. In other words, there's a lot of all the pixels in that photograph, a lot of them are because there's sodium being detected by this electron microscope. But if we coat it, as we have done with our coating, which has got a lot of carbon in it, and we tell the computer to colour carbon green, once you coat it, you can see that we've got green microspheres with very little red showing. The red dots are in fact an artifact in this photo because we didn't adjust the background quite properly, but the red blobs are slight imperfections in a microsphere. So this is with the world's best coating technology applied and done carefully, but even the very best in the world under an electron microscope can have gaps. Anyway, cut a long story short, we put those microspheres then into a peanut paste and managed to get a semi-shelf stable product that we can feed to pigs, and that's what Hoggone is. We've also done experiments with the Americans where we've added biomarker dyes, in this case rhodamine, which is that red stuff in that particular prototype hopper, And they've shown that we can label on a 30,000 nearly hectare acre property, we can label 75% of the pigs in one night with this red dye. That's phenomenal biomarkering of a free-ranging pest population. I won't go into the details due to time. We've also, with the help of the Americans, fed poisoned pigs to turkey vultures in cages. Five turkey vultures. They're what we have as a sort of a top-level scavenger bird, which they were worried about. And all the birds sat on their perch. They completely ate the poisoned pigs and not one of the birds was affected. So 100% success, no symptoms or deaths in the vultures, and they consumed the entire pig and we gave them no choice. In other words, we tried to force feed them a worst case scenario. That's a tough test. Likewise, USDA have done the same thing with coyotes. So they've fed individual coyotes poisoned pigs. They eat the whole pig. And the poison ones and the control ones are the same. They gain weight, they're quite happy. So we have actually not only shown with chemical residue analysis in all the edible tissues of a carcass, including things like eyeballs and liver and skin and liver, everything. There's no risk technically, but we've also confirmed it with actual in vivo studies. Then to sort of give you an example of just one field trial, this one was done in a place called Mount Hope. I call it Mount Hopeless, but anyway, it's in the centre of New South Wales near Hillston, pretty desolate spot. We in that area, they capture feral goats by putting traps around water holes with one-way gates. So we use those to collect the whole of the pigs coming in and out to the water. When you want to collect them, you just shut the gate in a one-way mode so they can come in, but they can't get out. So in this particular study, in 3 different traps, we trapped 107 feral pigs, but we didn't control what else came in. So we also trapped 50 feral goats, 10 kangaroos, and there's no lid on the pen, so the birds could fly in and out and lizards could come in and out through the mesh. So this was not only assessing efficacy on the pigs, but also virtually offering the bait directly to key non-targets. And the procedure was you must, and this is important, you must cluster a group of pigs to a feeding point. If you don't do that, you'll kill some pigs, but you won't kill them all because the rest of them will be wandering somewhere else. But they very quickly, like training a magpie or a cockatoo or something, if you feed them grain, they'll keep coming back to that point and the whole family will arrive and they know that's a feeding point. And that is the key to success. You want to actually clean the whole family up, not leave some behind. So we feed grain until we've got them feeding. Then we offer some grain and the placebo Hoggone without any poison in it because it's a new food type. Once they're eating that, we switch to the toxic Hoggone. And typically we only need to offer it for one night, but our protocols say, if you don't get them all on the first night, try again on the second night to see if you can mop up. So that's a very quick summary. When we did the trials, the pictures on the right show pigs eating wheat that's been sprinkled on top of placebo trays, and then the poison trays put out, and we just pegged them to the ground. When we did the registration, the APVMA said, no, you can't do that. You've got to put the bait in a hopper with a lid that only pigs can open. But we already had one developed with Americans, so we could do that quickly. So here's some pigs feeding, and I just used this photo to show the blue arrow because that's a pig not showing off, but he's got brucellosis. So if you are handling pigs out there, wear some gloves. I was very pleased to see Richard with his presentation of our baits wearing gloves. Well done, Richard. But same applies to the disease risk from handling these wild animals. They're not actually all that good for you. So here's an example of a mob of pigs in one of these pens, voraciously feeding on the poison bait. And the next morning, there's all the pigs, all laying on their side, all with their legs out the same way, and none of them with any regurgitation, or very few, and no struggling, no paddling, no disturbance of the soil, no thrashing about, nothing. So that's a pretty good result. To APVMA, I'm going very quickly. Yeah, Patrick, so I hope I'm not sort of rushing too much, but this is the hopper that we eventually developed with very close association with the USDA. In fact, we jointly patented it with them. And it has 2 positions for the lid to be open in a training phase, a metal bracket that holds the trays of bait into place so that the pigs can't easily get the bait, a full tray of bait out for another animal to eat. But pigs learn to lift that lid very, very quickly, like within hours, basically. If there's food in there, they'll get to it, and they eat the bait, and then they walk away and die. There's a picture of just that happening. This is a naive group of pigs in Queensland that actually, in this particular case, the guy doing this particular study, we knew these pigs were near those cattle, and he didn't pre-feed them at all. That way, he just offered them some poison bait, and every single one of them died.
So he didn't have the lid open for a training phase. He just went straight.
He didn't. He didn't.
Wow.
But I don't recommend that. But he, this particular, I won't mention his name because I don't think he will want to be described this way. But he took a few shortcuts. But in fact, it even worked with the shortcuts. But I honestly don't recommend that that's done, because you don't want to have a failure or a partial failure. If you do, go back to the slide with the pigs breeding. You know, if you leave half a dozen females behind, you'll have all your pigs back next year. I mean, it's as simple as that. Same with rabbits, and same with some of the other pests. The aim is local eradication. You can't say we're going to eradicate from the country, but if we all work together in a systematic way with all the tools, not just Hoggone, but